What depression is trying to tell you, a Jungian perspective. There's a peculiar silence that descends when you're depressed. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of meaning. You go through the motions, wake up, shower, eat, work, sleep. But it's as if you're watching someone else live your life through a thick pane of glass. The colors are muted, the tastes are flat. Even joy, when it comes, feels like a memory of a memory, something you once knew how to feel but have forgotten the language for. Here's what almost no one tells you about depression. It might be the most honest you've ever been with yourself. We live in a culture that treats depression as a malfunction, a chemical imbalance to be corrected, a temporary glitch in an otherwise smoothly running machine. Take this pill, think positive thoughts, practice gratitude, get more exercise, and yes, these things can help, they're often necessary. But what if we're asking the wrong question? What if instead of asking, how do I make this go away, we asked, what is this trying to show me? Carl Jung had a radical perspective on psychological suffering. He believed that what we call symptoms are actually the psyche's attempts at healing, messages from the depths of our being that something essential has been neglected, betrayed, or abandoned. Depression, in this view, isn't just happening to you. It's speaking to you, and it has something urgent to say. Let me tell you about someone we'll call Michael. On paper, his life looked perfect. Successful career in finance, beautiful apartment, a relationship that everyone envied, friends who texted regularly. He'd done everything right, followed every prescription for a good life. And yet, somewhere in his early 30s, he began to feel a heaviness that wouldn't lift. Not sadness exactly, sadness at least has an object, a reason. This was more like gravity had increased, like he was wading through deep water just to get through each day. Michael did what we're taught to do. He tried to fix it. More gym sessions, meditation apps, therapy that focused on cognitive distortions and behavioral activation. He could intellectually recognize that his thoughts weren't rational, that he should feel grateful, that exercise was supposed to help. But the heaviness remained, and now it carried an additional weight. Shame. Shame that he couldn't think his way out of this. Shame that his privileged life wasn't enough. Shame that he was failing at the simple task of being happy. What Michael didn't know, what most of us don't know, is that his depression wasn't a failure of gratitude or discipline or brain chemistry. It was a messenger arriving with urgent news. The life you're living isn't the life you're meant to be living. This is the strange paradox of depression. It often arrives precisely when things should be going well. You've achieved the goals, you've checked the boxes, you're living the life you thought you wanted. And then this profound emptiness opens up beneath you, and you can't understand why. The conventional explanation is that you're ungrateful, or your brain is malfunctioning, or you need to adjust your perspective. But Jung would say something different. Your psyche is rebelling against a betrayal so fundamental you don't even recognize it as betrayal. You've abandoned yourself, and depression is the alarm system screaming that something essential is dying from neglect. Think about how we typically frame depression. It's an illness, a disorder, something wrong with you that needs to be fixed. The language itself reveals our bias. Disorder implies there's a correct order to restore. Mental illness suggests the mind is sick and needs to be cured. But what if depression isn't a deviation from health, but rather an intelligent response to living in a way that violates your deepest nature? Consider the last time you felt truly alive. Not happy, not comfortable, but alive. When was it? For many people, they have to reach back years, sometimes decades. They remember a time before they made certain compromises, before they learned to silence certain voices within themselves, before they became realistic about what life could offer. And here's what's fascinating. Depression often becomes unbearable right around the time these compromises reach their breaking point. Sarah, a lawyer in her 40s, described her depression as a profound boredom that felt like dying. She'd worked incredibly hard to build her career, to prove herself in a male-dominated field, to make partner. The day it happened, the day she achieved what she'd sacrificed years to attain, she felt nothing. Worse than nothing. She felt as if she'd traded her soul for a title. The depression that followed wasn't random. It was her psyche saying, "This isn't it. This isn't what we're here for. You've been climbing the wrong mountain." The conventional approach would try to help Sarah adjust to her circumstances, to find meaning in what she'd achieved, to manage her expectations. But Jung would ask a different question. What part of Sarah did she have to kill to become successful? What aspects of herself did she exile to the shadows? What unlived life is crying out from within her? We're taught to fear depression, to see it as an enemy to be conquered. But what if it's more like pain, not pleasant, but informative? When you touch a hot stove, pain isn't malfunctioning. It's telling you something vital. Move your hand or you'll be damaged. What if depression works the same way? What if it's telling you, keep living this way and something essential in you will die, if it hasn't already? This is where things get uncomfortable, because it means depression might require not adjustment, but transformation. Not learning to cope better with your life, but changing your life in fundamental ways. It means the solution might not be in managing symptoms, but in listening to what those symptoms are revealing about how you've been living. The mystery deepens when we recognize that depression often feels like death, the death of energy, motivation, hope, meaning. What we don't see is that it might be trying to kill something that needs to die. Not you, but the false you. Not your life, but the unlived life. The one you've been performing instead of living. Jung understood that psychological death precedes rebirth, that sometimes the only way forward is through a kind of dying. But we're so terrified of death in any form that we medicate it, therapize it, positive, think it away before we can hear what it's trying to tell us. Carl Jung's approach to depression was revolutionary because he refused to see it merely as pathology. Instead, he understood it as what he called compensation, the psyche's attempt to restore balance when life has become too one-sided, too narrow, too disconnected from the deeper self. In Jung's view, the unconscious is constantly working to make us whole, and when we ignore its messages, it speaks louder. Depression, in this framework, is the unconscious shouting. Let's start with one of Jung's most crucial concepts, the persona. The persona is the mask we wear in the world, the social identity we construct to navigate our relationships, careers, and communities. It's the I you present at work, the version of yourself you show your family, the character you play at social gatherings. The persona isn't inherently problematic. We all need one. The problem arises when we confuse the persona with who we actually are. Jung observed that many people become so identified with their persona that they lose touch with their authentic self entirely. The successful businessman believes he is his success. The devoted mother believes she is her motherhood. The intellectual believes he is his intelligence. And then something happens, a failure, an empty nest, a realization that all this cleverness hasn't led to wisdom, and the identity collapses. What follows often looks like depression, but Jung would say it's actually the beginning of a process he called individuation, the journey toward becoming who you actually are. Here's where it gets fascinating. Jung noticed that depression frequently arrives at midlife, what he called the noon of life. In the first half of life, we're necessarily focused outward, building careers, forming relationships, establishing ourselves in the world. This requires developing a strong persona, and there's nothing wrong with this. But at midlife, the psyche begins to demand something different. It wants to turn inward. It wants to know, who are you beneath these masks? What have you neglected in your rush to become successful, acceptable, admirable? What parts of yourself did you exile to achieve all this? This is where the shadow enters. The shadow, in Jungian terms, is everything about yourself that you've rejected, repressed, or refused to acknowledge. It's not just the bad parts, though it includes those. It's everything that didn't fit the image you were trying to create. The artist who became an accountant has an artist in the shadow. The wild child who became responsible and proper has their wildness in the shadow. The emotional person who learned to be rational has their feelings in the shadow. When depression arrives, the shadow is often knocking at the door. All those exiled parts of yourself, all that unlived life, is demanding recognition. And because you've spent years, maybe decades, keeping these aspects hidden, their emergence feels like death. In a sense, it is death. The death of the false self, the death of the narrow identity you've been maintaining. But this death is necessary for rebirth. Jung used the term enantiodromia, borrowed from the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, to describe how things transform into their opposite when they reach an extreme. The person who's been relentlessly positive and optimistic swings into darkness. The rational, controlled person suddenly feels overwhelmed by emotion. The extroverted social butterfly finds themselves craving solitude. This isn't malfunction. It's the psyche's attempt to restore balance, to integrate what's been excluded. Depression, through this lens, is often the manifestation of enantiodromia. You've pushed too far in one direction, developed one aspect of yourself while neglecting others, and now the psyche is forcing a correction. The exhaustion you feel isn't laziness. It's the psyche putting the brakes on a life that's been moving in the wrong direction. The lack of motivation isn't weakness. It's the unconscious refusing to fuel activities that don't serve your deeper development. The emptiness isn't meaninglessness. It's the space being cleared for something more authentic to emerge. Consider Jung's concept of the self, not the ego, not the persona, but the deeper center of the psyche that represents wholeness. The self encompasses both consciousness and the unconscious, both the light and the shadow, both who you are and who you might become. When you live too far from the self, when your life becomes too narrow or false or disconnected from your essential nature, the psyche suffers. Depression is often the self trying to get your attention, trying to pull you back toward wholeness. Jung observed that his patients' symptoms often had a teleological dimension. They were pointing towards something, trying to move the person in a particular direction. A man's anxiety about public speaking might be trying to protect something vulnerable in him, or to prevent him from living a false life of performance. A woman's inability to leave her house might be the psyche insisting on an inward journey she's been avoiding. Depression's heaviness might be grounding you, stopping you from floating further away from yourself. This is where Jung's approach diverges radically from symptom management. He believed that the psyche is inherently purposive, always moving toward wholeness and meaning. What we call symptoms are often the psyche's compensatory mechanisms, its attempts to restore balance. The goal isn't to eliminate the symptoms, but to understand their message and respond to what they're revealing about the soul's needs. Jung also spoke of the individuation process as fundamentally a journey into solitude. You can't become who you actually are while constantly performing for others, constantly seeking external validation, constantly living according to collective values and expectations. Depression often forces this solitude. You withdraw, you lose interest in social performance. You can't muster the energy to maintain the mask. What feels like isolation might actually be the necessary retreat that allows you to hear your own voice again. The shadow work that depression demands is profound and often frightening. It means looking at the parts of yourself you've deemed unacceptable. It means acknowledging the rage beneath your niceness, the wildness beneath your respectability, the vulnerability beneath your strength, the chaos beneath your control. Jung insisted that we can't become whole by being only good, only light, only acceptable. We become whole by integrating everything, especially what we've most adamantly rejected. What Jung called active imagination becomes crucial here, the practice of dialoguing with these unconscious aspects, giving them voice, allowing them to speak. In depression, you might feel haunted by dark thoughts, by a critical inner voice, by images of failure or death. Jung would say, don't just try to silence these, ask them what they want, ask them what they are protecting, ask them what you've been refusing to see. The collective unconscious, another central Jungian concept, reminds us that we're not just individual selves, but carriers of ancient human patterns and experiences. The depression you're feeling connects you to the universal human experience of loss, death, transformation, and rebirth. You're living a story that humans have lived for millennia, the dark night of the soul, the descent into the underworld, the encounter with the shadow. This doesn't diminish your suffering, but it places it in a larger context of meaning. Friedrich Nietzsche, who himself battled profound psychological suffering, wrote about what he called the death of God, not just a theological statement, but a description of what happens when our fundamental meaning structures collapse. Depression often arrives as precisely this kind of collapse. The values you've oriented your life around suddenly ring hollow. The goals that motivated you lose their pull. The identity you've constructed feels like a costume you can't remember putting on. You're experiencing what existential philosophers call groundlessness, the vertigo of recognizing that the foundations you thought were solid were actually constructions all along. Nietzsche also gave us the concept of the last man, the person who seeks only comfort, security, and the avoidance of suffering. The last man asks, what is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? And blinks, having lost the capacity to reach for anything beyond mere survival and pleasure. Depression might be what arrives when you've been living as a last man, when you've traded your deeper nature for security and comfort, when you've become what Nietzsche feared, someone who can no longer become who they are. But Nietzsche also understood something profound about suffering. He wrote that we can bear almost any how, if we have a strong enough why. Depression often represents the loss of why, not just why get out of bed, but why live at all. And the conventional responses, because you have responsibilities, because people need you, because life is precious, feel like lies when you're in the depths. What depression might be revealing is that your previous why was never really yours. It was borrowed, inherited, imposed. The psyche is demanding an authentic why, one that comes from your own depths rather than from external expectations. Soren Kierkegaard, the father of existentialism, described what he called the sickness unto death, a despair that comes from not being willing to be oneself. He distinguished between different forms of despair: the despair of not being conscious of having a self, the despair of willing to be someone else, and the despair of willing to be oneself. Depression often contains elements of all three. You've lost touch with your authentic self. You've been trying to be someone you're not, and now you're facing the terrifying responsibility of actually becoming yourself. Kierkegaard understood that this confrontation with authentic selfhood is fundamentally anxiety-provoking. It's easier to live according to convention, to follow the script society provides, to be who others expect you to be. The leap of faith he described isn't just religious. It's the leap into your own existence, the radical act of choosing to become who you actually are despite all uncertainty and fear. Depression might be the crisis that precedes this leap, the necessary breakdown of false certainty that makes authentic choice possible. Eastern philosophy offers another lens. In Buddhist thought, suffering dukkha arises from attachment and identification, attachment to things being other than they are, identification with a solid, separate self that doesn't actually exist. Depression, in this view, might represent the friction between reality and our desperate clinging to how we think things should be. We're attached to a self-image that no longer fits, to a life that isn't ours, to meanings that have dissolved. The Buddhist concept of sunyata, emptiness, isn't nihilism, but rather the recognition that all phenomena are interdependent and lacking in fixed essence. The emptiness you feel in depression might be pointing to this truth. The self you thought you were was always empty of fixed nature, always contingent, always changing. What feels like loss might actually be liberation, if you can stop clinging to what was never solid to begin with. Taoism speaks of wu-wei effortless action, going with the flow rather than forcing. Depression often arrives when we've been forcing too hard, swimming against our own nature, exhausting ourselves trying to be something we're not. The exhaustion, the inability to push forward, might be the Tao redirecting you. What if the depression isn't something to overcome through willpower, but something to move with, to follow to where it's trying to take you? Martin Heidegger distinguished between authentic and inauthentic existence. Inauthentic existence is being absorbed in the they, doing what they do, valuing what they value, living how they live. Authentic existence requires confronting what Heidegger called being toward death, recognizing your own finitude, your own mortality, and letting this recognition transform how you live. Depression might be the moment when inauthenticity becomes unbearable, when the they self collapses and you're forced to confront the question, how will you live the finite time you have? The French existentialists, particularly Sartre and Camus, insisted on the fundamental absurdity of existence. There's no inherent meaning, no cosmic purpose, no guaranteed salvation. For Camus, this recognition leads to what he called philosophical suicide, escaping into false meaning systems or actual suicide, unless we can perform what he called the revolt, creating meaning despite the absurd, becoming passionately engaged with life even while recognizing its ultimate meaninglessness. Depression might be the confrontation with the absurd, the moment when inherited meanings collapse and you must decide, will you create your own meaning or succumb to nihilism? The philosopher Gabriel Marcel distinguished between a problem, which can be solved, and a mystery, which can only be participated in. Our culture treats depression as a problem. Apply the right treatment, implement the right strategies, and it will be solved. But what if depression is a mystery? What if it's something you must enter into, move through, allow to transform you? What if the question isn't, how do I solve this? But, what is this calling me to become? Greek tragedy offers yet another perspective. The tragic hero suffers not because they're bad, but because they're caught in forces larger than themselves, fate, the gods, the consequences of past actions. There's a kind of nobility in tragic suffering, a confrontation with fundamental limits and necessities. Your depression might have its own tragic dimension. You're caught in forces you didn't choose: genetics, childhood, trauma, culture. Yet how you face this fate determines who you become. The Greeks understood that some suffering ennobles rather than diminishes. The medieval mystics spoke of the dark night of the soul, a period of spiritual desolation where all previous consolations fail, where God seems absent, where nothing you do can recreate the sense of meaning or connection you once had. St. John of the Cross insisted this darkness was actually divine grace, a purification that burns away false attachments and prepares the soul for a deeper union. Whether or not you're religious, the pattern holds. Sometimes the death of old meanings is necessary for truer meanings to emerge. So, how does this understanding translate into lived experience? How do you actually work with depression as message rather than malfunction? First, you must learn to listen differently. When the exhaustion comes, instead of immediately fighting it or judging yourself for it, ask, what is this exhaustion protecting me from? What activity or role or relationship is it trying to stop me from continuing? Often, you'll find that the exhaustion is specifically targeted. You can't muster energy for your job, but you can for certain conversations. Or you can't engage with social obligations, but you find yourself drawn to solitary activities you'd long abandoned. Pay attention to these specificities. Your psyche isn't broken uniformly. It's withdrawing energy from certain areas while potentially preserving it for others. The things that suddenly feel meaningless might actually be meaningless for you. The activities you can no longer force yourself to do might be the ones most out of alignment with your authentic self. This doesn't mean you should immediately quit your job or abandon your responsibilities, but it does mean taking seriously what your loss of energy is revealing. You might notice a particular quality to your thoughts during depression. There's often a harsh, critical inner voice that sounds almost inhuman in its cruelty. You're worthless, you're a failure, you're a burden, nothing you do matters. Jung would ask, whose voice is this? It's often the voice of the shadow, but more specifically, it's often the voice of internalized judgments: parents, teachers, society, culture. The voice that says you're not enough is usually the voice that demanded you be something other than yourself in the first place. One practice is to externalize this voice, to imagine it as a character rather than as truth. What does it look like? What does it want? Often, you'll find it's trying to protect you through punishment, trying to control you through shame, trying to keep you small because it believes that's safe. You can dialogue with it. I hear that you think I'm worthless. What are you afraid would happen if I believed I had value? This kind of active imagination can reveal the defensive nature of depressive thinking. The pull towards solitude in depression is worth honoring rather than fighting. Yes, isolation can deepen depression, but there's a difference between lonely isolation and sacred solitude. Sacred solitude is withdrawing not from life, but toward yourself. It's creating space to hear your own voice beneath the noise of others' expectations. You might find yourself craving time alone in nature, or with art, or with writing, or in silence. These aren't symptoms of withdrawal from life. They're signs of a necessary inward journey. Watch for what Jung called compensation dreams, dreams that reveal what consciousness is neglecting. In depression, dreams often become more vivid, more intense, more symbolic. You might dream of being trapped or lost or pursuing something you can never reach. You might dream of death, of falling, of houses with hidden rooms. These dreams aren't random, they're the unconscious revealing what needs attention. Keep a journal, Notice patterns. Ask what these images might be trying to communicate. The process of shadow integration is particularly crucial. This means deliberately engaging with the parts of yourself you've rejected. If you've always been responsible and dependable, depression might be inviting irresponsibility, playfulness, spontaneity. If you've been strong and independent, it might be inviting vulnerability and need. If you've been rational and controlled, it might be inviting emotion and wildness. These aren't destructive impulses, they're neglected aspects of wholeness trying to find their place in your life. This integration happens gradually and often uncomfortably. You might start small. The responsible person takes an unplanned day off. The intellectual person lets themselves cry. The independent person asks for help. Each act of integration feels risky because it threatens your identity, your sense of who you are. But this is precisely the point. Your current identity is too narrow, and depression is demanding you expand it. One warning: there's a difference between integration and acting out. Integration means consciously choosing to develop neglected aspects. Acting out means being possessed by them unconsciously. The chronically nice person who suddenly rages at everyone isn't integrating their anger. They're being overtaken by it. True integration involves dialogue, consciousness, and choice. You're not abandoning your strengths, but adding dimensions to them. You'll know integration is happening when contradictions become less troubling. You can be both strong and vulnerable, both serious and playful, both independent and connected. You're no longer locked into being one thing. This flexibility, this capacity to move between different aspects of yourself, is what Jung meant by wholeness. Not perfection, but completeness. The question of medication and therapy deserves attention here. This Jungian perspective doesn't preclude other interventions. Sometimes depression has biochemical components that require medication. Sometimes you need support to even begin this inner work. The key is not seeing these as alternatives, but as potential allies in the larger process. Medication might give you the stability to do the deeper work. Therapy might provide the container to safely explore these territories. What changes is the goal. Instead of just managing symptoms to return to normal, you're using whatever tools available to support a transformation. You're not trying to go back to who you were before depression. You're trying to become who you've always been beneath the false self. This is why some people who emerge from depression say they're grateful for it, not because it wasn't hell, but because it destroyed a life that was already death and made space for something truer. The shift, when it comes, is subtle at first. Not sudden happiness. That's not how this works. Instead, it's more like the slow return of color to a world that's been gray. You notice a moment of genuine interest in something, a flash of actual desire rather than obligation. You have a conversation where you say something true instead of something nice, and the world doesn't end. You make a small choice based on what you actually want rather than what you should want. These moments are fragile at first. You might slip back into the heaviness, doubt whether anything has really changed. But gradually they accumulate. You begin to recognize the feeling of authenticity, not happiness, but realness. There's a solidity to it, a sense of standing on ground rather than floating in water. You're less concerned with how you appear and more interested in what's actually happening. Conversations become less performative, more genuine. You're less exhausted because you're not constantly maintaining a false self. One of the strange paradoxes of this transformation is that you might become less impressive to others while feeling more substantial to yourself. The drive to achieve, to prove, to excel often diminishes. This isn't lazy. It's that the motivation to excel was often connected to the persona, to proving your worth, to earning love through accomplishment. As you become more rooted in your authentic self, the need for external validation decreases. You're less interested in being admired and more interested in being true. Your relationship with suffering changes. Not that you welcome pain, you're not a masochist, but you recognize that suffering often carries information, that it's not always the enemy. You become curious about your own resistance, your own pain, when heaviness returns, and it will return, though differently. You're less panicked by it. You know how to listen now. You ask, what's happening? What's this trying to tell me? What have I been neglecting? The capacity for joy returns, but it's different than before. It's not the manic highs of escaping yourself or the desperate grasping at pleasure. It's quieter, more grounded. You laugh more easily. You find yourself moved by small things, sunlight on water, a moment of connection, a line in a poem. The world becomes more vivid not because it's changed, but because you're actually present to experience it, rather than lost in performance or judgment or anxiety about how you're being perceived. You develop what Jung called psychological mindedness, an awareness of your own inner processes, your patterns, your complexes. You notice when you're slipping into old identities, when you're performing rather than being, when you're betraying yourself in small ways. This awareness gives you choice. You can correct more quickly. You can catch yourself before months or years of living falsely accumulate into another crisis. Relationships transform. Some fall away, the ones that were based on your false self, on who you were pretending to be, on dynamics of approval, seeking, or people pleasing. This loss is painful but necessary. New relationships form, or old ones deepen, but they're based on something different now. You're more honest, more boundaried, more present. You can tolerate conflict because you're not desperately maintaining an image. You can be alone because you're not running from yourself. Your work life might change dramatically, or might stay the same externally while transforming internally. You might discover that your career was always wrong for you and make a major shift. Or you might stay in the same field but approach it differently, less about proving yourself, more about genuine contribution. Or you might find ways to integrate neglected aspects into your existing life. The lawyer who starts painting again, the executive who begins teaching, the scientist who writes poetry. There's often a quality of what Jung called vocation that emerges, not just a job but a calling, a sense of what you're here to do. This isn't always grand or dramatic. It might be teaching or gardening or raising children or creating beauty or simply being a person who sees others truly. The point isn't what it is, but that it feels aligned with your deepest nature, with the self rather than the persona. You become more comfortable with paradox, with holding contradictions without needing to resolve them. You're both wounded and healing, both broken and whole, both in process and complete. You don't need to be always strong or always together. You're more human, which means more vulnerable, more flawed, more real. And paradoxically, this makes you more capable of genuine strength, genuine wisdom, genuine compassion. The relationship with death changes too. Having experienced a kind of psychological death, having felt the collapse of identity and meaning, you're less terrified of mortality. Not that you want to die, but you know that death and transformation are woven into life, that things must end for other things to begin, that holding too tightly to what was prevents what could be. You're more able to let go, to accept change, to trust the process even when you can't see where it's leading. What you've gained is hard to name. It's not happiness, though you might be happier. It's not success, though you might be more successful in ways that actually matter to you. It's more like authenticity, aliveness, presence, depth. You feel more real. Your life feels more yours. You're less haunted by the unlived life because you're living more of it. The depression may have been hell, but it burned away what was false and revealed what was true. Remember that person we imagined at the beginning, going through the motions in a life that felt like watching through glass. What depression was trying to tell them, what it might be trying to tell you, is that the glass itself was the problem. You'd encased yourself in an identity that wasn't yours, in a life that was killing your soul by degrees, in a performance that exhausted you because it required constant betrayal of your authentic nature. The message wasn't "you're broken." It was "this isn't you." It wasn't "there's something wrong with you." It was "there's something wrong with how you've been living." It wasn't "you should die." It was "something in you must die so that something truer can be born." Jung understood that the psyche is always moving toward wholeness, that these periods of darkness and breakdown are part of the soul's growth, that we can't become who we are without confronting who we've been pretending to be. Depression, in this light, is one of the most profound calls to transformation available to us. Painful beyond measure, yes, but potentially catalytic for genuine change. This doesn't make it easy. It doesn't make it painless. It doesn't mean you shouldn't seek help, shouldn't take medication if needed, shouldn't reach out when you're suffering. But it does mean there's meaning in the darkness, intelligence in the symptoms, purpose in the pain. Depression might be the psyche's most desperate attempt to get your attention, to say, "You've wandered too far from yourself, and I'm shutting down the systems that support this false life because something essential is dying and needs to be saved." The journey of listening to depression, of doing the shadow work, of integrating what's been rejected, of moving toward authentic selfhood. This is the journey of individuation that Jung described. It's lonely, often frightening, and profoundly transformative. It asks everything of you. It demands you stop living for others' expectations and start living from your own depths. It requires you to value truth over comfort, authenticity over approval, depth over surface success. But on the other side, and there is another side, is a life that feels like yours, not perfect, not without suffering, but real in a way that makes even the pain meaningful. You're no longer haunted by the person you might have been because you're becoming that person. You're no longer exhausted by constant performance because you're learning to simply be. You're no longer living someone else's life through glass because you've broken through and discovered your own. The question depression asked was never "should I exist?" It was "can I exist as I truly am?" And the answer hard, one, painfully earned, worth every step of the journey, is yes. Not the you that you thought you should be, not the you that others needed you to be, but the you that was always there beneath it all, waiting to be recognized, honored, and lived.